Good evening and welcome to the third Thursday lecture series for the Monroe County Historical Association. My name is Amy Leiser and I am the Executive Director of the Historical Association. We're very happy to have you with us tonight. I know we're going to have a very entertaining program. And at the bottom of the screen, I just want to let you know that there is a menu bar that has a Q&A option, and you are welcome to ask questions throughout the presentation. Just type your question in, and we will be able to answer those questions. We'll present them to Dr. Brian Alnutt, and he will be able to answer your questions following tonight's program. Without any further delay, I am very happy to introduce Dr. Brian Alnutt to you. Now, Dr. Alnutt was born in Philadelphia and he was raised in South Jersey, excuse me. He is a professor of history at Northampton Community College, where he teaches at both the Bethlehem and at the Monroe campuses since 2009. His particular historical interests are the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as well as American race and ethnic relations and foreign policy. He lives with his family in rural New Tripoli, Pennsylvania. Thank you so much, Brian, for joining us tonight. Is he there?
I am here.
There you are. Yay, wonderful. Thank you so much for coming here tonight and talking. He's going to give a presentation on the era of Prohibition.
Yes, I am. And before I do, I'm going to ask all of us are home, I believe, or in some kind of comfortable setting. I wonder how many folks have a cocktail or beer near them at this moment.
I was wondering that too. I don't know if anyone's going to confess. They can confess in the comments.
In the comments, rhetorical question. Anyways, thanks for having me here on a very nice night. I mean, it's a really beautiful night. So wherever you are, thanks for indulging us and in coming to hear this and hopefully get involved in a good conversation. So thanks very much for showing up and being here. I teach at the campus in Tannersville, and I'm interested in Lehigh Valley affairs, Monroe County affairs, and in our era, the issue of alcohol and substance abuse, of course, is front and center, and of course the anniversary, the century anniversary of the enactment of Prohibition was this year. So it's an appropriate time to take a look at it, and so we will. And I'm going to give you some ideas of the history of it and sort of the background, intellectual background, some of the religious backgrounds, enactment of it, and then sort of the follow-up as well coming into our time. So let's do it. Let's roll. I have a lot of PowerPoints and illustrations. So if you don't mind, much of this is going to be myself screen sharing some illustrations and things I have. So you probably won't see me that much, but at the end you will. And we can do some Q&A. Here we go. I'm going to think about Prohibition, about alcohol, and about ways this has been dealt with. And obviously, Prohibition, all of us know, was about 13 years when the US as a nation banned the manufacture, sale, or transport of alcoholic beverages, spirits of any kind, including beer. And most of us know it seems to have failed and produced a lot of interesting side effects. So let's take a look and see sort of how we got there. And it's interesting because we look at society from which we came, traditional Western society, European Western society. There was not a long history of having attempts to prohibit the use of alcohol. Alcohol in terms of especially wine and beer or things of that kind, fermented beverages, go back many centuries, well into antiquity. And its use in Western culture had been pretty widespread up until really the 18th, 19th centuries. Religiously, most Europeans were either Western Roman Catholics or Eastern Orthodox. Both of those religions used wine as sacramental beverages, had no real difficulties using alcohol in what they said was a controlled way. Now, the Bible, and I'm using this because Western society was really governed for most of the last couple millennia by that. Contains no prohibitions against drinking. It does contain exhortations not to drink to excess. And so, in theory, Western society was against excessive drinking, drunkardness, irresponsibility, but had no difficulty with drinking to some degree. Of course, most of us know that monasteries manufactured wine beverages, etc. I myself was in a place called Chamonix, France last year. That's in the French Alps last summer, and purchased an expensive bottle of something called chartreuse, which is a greenish liquor manufactured by monks in a nearby monastery. And so it's very expensive. And so that's a deep tradition with them. And so, the idea of banning alcohol was not really deep in Western society. Even in our own early colonial era, we think of the Puritans, the Pilgrims of New England. We think of them as being very strict or stern people, banning many traditional behaviors as being immoral or unchristian. They themselves did not have an issue with alcohol. Once again, they didn't encourage excessive drinking. Once again, that's not encouraged, but moderate alcohol, sure. The first Thanksgiving, for instance, 1621, featured all kinds of beer drinking. They made wine, attempted to make apple liquors as well. So the Puritans weren't really against this. So the first attempts to strictly limit or ban alcohol really arise in the later part of the 17th century. You might call it the 1600s. The Society of Friends, the Quakers, arose in England at that time. And just fair warning, I am myself a Quaker. I was raised as a member of the Society of Friends, so I kind of know it from the inside. And they began to discourage at least heavy alcohol drinking pretty early in their denominational history. Not attempting to ban it, but emphasizing it'd be better to avoid alcohol and certainly best to limit it, to be temperate. The Methodists, also rising in England in the early 1700s, had some of the same sort of beliefs. These two growing denominations began to pressure their members in England and here in North America to begin avoiding alcohol or certainly limiting it strictly for the benefit of a better, more moral life. And so you began to see that growing, but it really was within those denominations. They weren't really trying to expand that to the broader society, simply trying to control their own member behaviors. Meanwhile, as we get through the colonial period, not going to get too deep into the revolution, but as we get through that period, alcohol consumption in North America, what became the US, was very high. The term I use is through the roof. Historians, by a variety of measures, look at alcohol consumption during that revolutionary and early national period, early 19th century, as being roughly 5 to 6 gallons of alcohol per capita, per person. All right. Today it's around 2 some. So just think about what that means in terms of people slamming down homemade Applejack. By this time, distilled beverages like whiskey, rum from the Caribbean were becoming very popular. Imagine enjoying a big pewter tankard full of room temperature rum. Think about how much fun that would be. They did begin to add fruit ingredients at that point. You began to see rum punches appear. But still very, very high consumption. Now, that's our baseline. That's where we were in the early 19th century, 1810s, 1820s or so. Around that time, something, and as a historical society, many of you probably know this, something began to appear throughout the US and North America, religious phenomena we call the Second Great Awakening. There had been a Great Awakening back in the colonial era, but this was the Second Great Awakening. And it was a real revival among many Protestant denominations. So not just Methodists, also Presbyterians, some Episcopalians, Baptists, some Quakers, many denominations became involved in this Second Great Awakening. And it really stretched throughout the length of the US, from Kentucky, the Carolinas, up into New England, emphasizing the idea of personal revival, but more than that, emphasizing the idea of an improved and Christianized broader society. In other words, not just the denomination itself should be cleansed and become more Christian and more devoted, but society should become more Christian, improved, more moral. Christian virtues should be extended to the rest of society. So some of the causes that you begin to see, led by pastors and activists in the Second Great Awakening, 1830s, 1840s, are things like public Christian morality, Sabbatarianism. That means the strict observance of the Sabbath, Sunday. Not engaging in unwholesome recreations at that time and trying to honor the Sabbath. improved education, including moral education for children, hospital improvement, prison reform, a variety of different causes. The real hot spot for these broader causes in the Second Great Awakening are up in New England and especially upstate New York, the western parts of New York. Some people at the time called New York State the burned over district because the level of religious fervor was so high there. And these evangelicals also endorsed things like in the North, abolition of slavery. The abolitionist cause began to grow among some of these evangelical reformers. Women's rights, and these were all linked. Not every member of the Second Great Awakening believed in all these causes, but many of them overlapped. For instance, many of the abolitionist leaders, male abolitionist leaders, believed also in the idea of women's rights, women's suffrage, believed in temperance, limiting alcohol. So there's a lot of intertwining among these different causes. Temperance emerges as one of the major themes, okay? It links evangelicals looking to improve society and family life. We also see a growth of interest in temperance among employers, the growing business class, who are concerned about workers' traditional use of alcohol in the job and what that does for productivity. There was tradition of something called Blue Monday, for instance. Workers, given that Sunday, the Sabbath, was the only workers' day off. The work week was 6 days at that point. Workers getting slam drunk on Sundays, as Sunday evening, and then not showing up for work, and Monday became known as Blue Monday. Some of you may recall a 50s song with that title. It's not quite the same linkage, but Blue Monday was a slang term at this time for workers either being inefficient on Monday because they're hungover or just not showing up. So employers began worrying about that too and emphasizing the idea of temperance as a way to improve predictability, productivity, and just a better, more moral society. So you begin to see associations forming. I'm going to mention a couple of these. There's a number of them. The first one I want to mention is something called the Sons of Temperance. Sons of Temperance. And that's a group that began up in New England in 1842 and then spread southward into the mid-Atlantic states. And here's where I'm going to start doing some screen sharing to show you some of the illustrations. I think might add some, see if I can bring this up here. And bear with me a second while I bring this up and have us take a look at this. I'm going to set this to do a presentation and see if we can have this going here. There we go. Okay, let me start right here. This is a poster that became popular at the time we're discussing here, the Second Great Awakening. It's an illustration which was a print, was sold, huge numbers, called The Drunkard's Progress. Evangelicals, reformers, worrying about the drunken lives of young men consuming their typical quota of alcohol at that time. And so if you look at this picture, some of you may have seen this before, you see a young man starting out at the left side, beginning a proper life. He's well-dressed. He's about to wed his sweetheart. You see her there on the left side, a very moral marriage. He's beginning life on the right foot. As you go across the arch here, he meets the wrong people, descends into idleness and drunkenness. His life goes completely to hell. On the right side, he's nothing but an idle, stumbling, inebriate, irresponsible. They would simply use the word drunkard at this time. And the illustration, I'm afraid, didn't come through to show you at the bottom of this, beneath the arch, you see his wife and small child standing by a ruined house because this man, by throwing away his life in pursuit of demon rum, has ruined his home life, left his wife and child bereft, and that's what needs to be addressed. So the Sons of Temperance began in New England in 1842. And here is one of their badges. It's a mutual support group. You can sort of compare it in a vague way to today's 12-step groups, today's recovery groups. This was a male group. Men meet together to discuss their drinking problems and reinforce themselves in avoidance of strong liquor. Members were urged to take what they called the cold water pledge, drinking only cold water, avoiding all ardent spirits, all beer, all wine. There was an auxiliary group for women called the Daughters of Temperance. And that was more of a support group, not so much that they expected women to be heavy drinkers, but these are women who were concerned about the drinking of the men. And a couple notable members included Susan B. Anthony, who had been raised a Quaker, not surprisingly, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And if you know those names, they got involved very quickly in the women's rights movement later on. The program of the Sons of Temperance is to avoid excessive drinking. Now, the ideal is to avoid all drinking, to take that cold water pledge, but at least avoid drinking to excess. And the movement did begin at this early stage discussing the idea of women's suffrage. At this time, just to backtrack a bit, women could not vote. They had been able to some limited degree in some states up until the early 1800s, but by this point they couldn't vote at all. Voting was for men. Began to have an interest in women pushing for the vote for the purpose of controlling society and enforcing morality. Another movement, you see an illustration there to the right, was called the Washington Movement, also known as the Washingtonians. Began in 1840 in Baltimore. And this is even closer to today's model of what AA or other 12-step groups are like. These were heavy drinking men who got together regularly, weekly or bi-weekly, and held rallies, meetings, confessed their sins, confessed their heavy drinking, and pledged to avoid drink and to reform. So this spread throughout the nation from Baltimore up into New England by the mid-1840s. And it too generated a women's auxiliary called the Martha Washingtons. It began to fade away by the late 1840s. The Sons of Temperance kind of outcompeted it and became the more dominant group. If I can get this to show here, that is one of the gazebos put up by the Sons of Temperance, showing the idea of an ornate, beautiful cold water fountain for men who have taken that cold water pledge. Here's the source of pure, moral drink that will refresh a person, allow a person to keep a proper, predictable, moral family life and work properly. So the cold water fountains began appearing across the country, sort of as symbols of the temperance ideal. A play appeared around this time, known as 10 Nights in a Bar Room. It began as a novel, then became a play. And what basically is about is a fellow who gets involved in owning a tavern. And you can see, I mean, I think the message of the play is pretty clear looking at this. Ends up in ruins, smashed, injured in brawls, and someone is killed in a brawl. People die of intoxication. So, you know, this once again is a very popular play. Message that strong liquor is a terrible problem. By the 1850s, you know, this is still mid-19th century, this man became nationally famous. His name is Neil Dow, and he was the mayor of Portland, Maine, elected in 1851. Guess what? He was a Quaker. And Neil Dow was also a strong believer in temperance and believed that, you know, not only should individuals take the cold water pledge, but the government should limit or ban alcohol sales. It wasn't enough for people to voluntarily agree to do this. That wasn't far-reaching enough. It wasn't persuasive enough. The state needed to do it. So he was able to pressure the Maine legislature to pass a law, which became known nationally as the Maine Law, banning manufacture or sale of any alcoholic products anywhere in the state of Maine, 1851. And the law was repealed a couple times. It was reimposed a couple times. Eventually, by the 1880s, 30 years later, Maine's state constitution added articles banning the sale or manufacture of alcohol anywhere in the state of Maine. That was obviously pretty permanent. But Maine was the first dry state in the U.S., and Maine law became a sort of a slang term across the country. If you look over there on the right, that's a newspaper article about the Maine law. I'm not sure if you can read the whole thing because we have some boxes there. But if you look at a quote and see in the streets of Portland, temperate men and nothing but temperate men walk her streets. No places serve strong drink, and there is no visible intoxication, no rioting, no, look at the ideal that's being established here, the ideal of a calm, reformed, moral society. Interesting, and we'll get back to this, but I'm going to introduce the idea here that if you think about some of these reforms that are being proposed, let's focus on temperance for a second. You might look at them as being coming from, if we're looking at a left-right continuum, maybe kind of from the left, because they're trying to use the state to improve society, to impose improvements on society, social improvements on society that are not traditional to society at that time. These are innovations, okay? You could also say, and it's funny because when you look at history, that left-right spectrum isn't always applicable. You could say it's coming from the right also because of business interests and churchmen who want society to be strict and moral and don't like the idea of riotous behavior, especially by the lower classes who are often as being suspected of being out of control. So you can look at it from a couple different sides, and I wanted to bring that up because we're going to look at prohibition later on, taking a decidedly different tack. But at this stage, it's interlaced with things like, in some cases, women's rights, abolition, prison reform, causes of that sort. One thing I want to bring up here, and I'll just leave this illustration up while I get into this, is a little bit of ethnic religious tension that you can see here. Most advocates of temperance or prohibition were old-line, what we might call native stock Protestants. These are the folks you might call, in our slang, WASPs, Anglo-Saxon, Scots, perhaps, of Protestant denominations, so Baptists, Presbyterians, Quakers, people such as that. Despite the fact that, I'm not saying every old stock Protestant believed in this. Scots, Irish settlers, Scotch settlers had a long tradition of making whiskey, for instance, which continued up, especially in the Appalachian Mountain area. But the people advocating for this mostly were old stock, we call WASPy Protestants. Later waves of immigrants were not necessarily interested in this and were rather taken aback. Germans, for instance, Protestant and Catholic, especially later waves of Catholic Germans, had deep traditions of beer gardens in Germany where whole families would go and they would eat and drink beer, mostly in moderation. I've been to such beer gardens in Germany recently. They're extremely pleasant. They were not interested and rather surprised by the fervor of this movement. Another wave of mid-19th century immigrants was even more taken aback by this, and that is the Irish Catholics who began coming in the 1830s, 1840s. These immigrants became known as wets, and they became targets for the reformers. They were seen as being dissolute, immoral, drunk, and especially, I don't need to get into all the issues that surround the Irish immigrants. Some of us are familiar with them. Irish Catholics came in and were, targeted by all kinds of what we call nativist persecution for a variety of reasons, religion, racial issues, etc. But one of the issues that these local Protestants complained about was that the Irish supposedly drank heavily, and that was somehow interlinked with their Catholicism, making them immoral. If I go a little bit later in the 19th century, began to see a party alignment as our political parties developed. By the 1850s, we have our two parties we have today, the Democrats and Republicans. The Republicans tend to be more old stock, Protestant, Anglo-Yankee backgrounds, people of that sort. And they slowly became involved with the dry cause, the cause of eliminating alcohol. The Democrats tended not to believe too much in social control. Live and let live was kind of their motto. Quite a few old-line Yankee Protestants were Democrats, but also many immigrants, Germans, especially Irish, joined the Democratic Party. It was less interested in temperance or prohibition, much more tolerant of their customs and not trying to impose morality on them. And a political scandal occurred toward the end of the 19th century, 1880s, after the Civil War, when a Republican activist he was a Protestant minister and Republican, was having a discussion in Washington and labeled the Democratic Party the party of rum, Romanism, and rebellion. Remember, the Civil War had just been put down. Democrats been the primary Southern secessionists. So rum, Romanism, and rebellion. And that was kind of really a symbol of the gap between the two viewpoints of the parties by the late 19th century. As time went on, Democrats are generally tolerant of immigrants and alcohol and not interested in social control. As we get toward the late 19th century, the Reconstruction period, toward the end of the 19th century, you see a change among Southern Democrats. They start to embrace the idea of temperance and prohibition for racial control reasons. The blacks are now free. Obviously, slavery ended with the end of the Civil War. And if anyone knows about the Reconstruction period, a lot of extreme racial tension, very strong white supremacist feelings arose among many Southern whites, most of whom were Democrats. And because they suspected that the free black population was, quote, immoral and could not control its drinking and become dangerous and violent if they drank, Southern white Democrats began to break with the Northern Democratic Party and endorse the idea of temperance, of prohibition, of being dry, because in their view it would help control what they saw as their dangerous, black neighbors. Let's get back into some of the organizational efforts involving prohibition. A group called the Women's Christian Temperance Union was founded in Ohio in 1874. And the woman on the right was the leader of this. Her name is Frances Willard. She'd been born, interestingly enough, in the same upstate New York town in which Susan B. Anthony was born. And both of them separately became involved in both women's rights issues and in temperance issues. As I mentioned, Susan B. Anthony had been a temperance advocate before she got involved in the women's rights movement. The WCTU pushed for national prohibition, not temperance, national prohibition. And their slogan was, moderation in all things healthful, total abstinence from all things harmful. They believed women were moral guardians of the nation and of the home. Women were victimized by irresponsible, male, domineering drinkers. If women could achieve more power over this, if they could limit alcohol. In fact, one of the reasons that Frances Willard and the WCTU became strong advocates for women's suffrage, allies of Susan B. Anthony in that effort, was that they believed if women could gain suffrage, they would be able to exert their moral influence, because they believed women were pure and moral, on society, and also find a way to limit alcohol. So it's a very religiously organized, focused organization. As I said, it's not, Susan B. Anthony is not a member of it, but they work sort of in tandem on the cause of both women's suffrage and on the cause of temperance and prohibition. Here I should mention, Amy Lizer, director of this Monroe County Association, did a neat article about the temperance and prohibition movement here in Monroe County. I believe it was in 2007. And it highlighted the fact that the local unit of the WCTU was active here in Monroe County, very active, and was pressing very hard for at least county level prohibition up until the late 19th and early 20th centuries, pushing very hard for this. Many of our resorts in Monroe County, and I think many of you know this, were owned and operated by Quaker or otherwise dry proprietors. So alcohol wasn't seen as a huge problem for the resort population, but still the local WCTU felt it needed to be limited or outlawed. They did not, in this county, have success in that. Before we had national prohibition, a number of Pennsylvania counties did go dry, county level prohibition, but that was never the case in Monroe County. So the WCTU was active here, but was not able to achieve success. Here's an interesting poster and slogan of the WCTU. Look at this and ponder that for a moment, okay? we encouraged men to avoid the evils of alcohol for the sake of ladies, pressing hard for this, pressing hard that we really need to improve family life and improve national life in the country. This is the enemy. Here we see not just the barrel of beer, not just the bottle of rum. Those are enemies too. But what we have here is the saloon. The saloon, seen as the focus of all things evil. Look at these men here. These are working class men for the most part. And they're in a bar and they're drinking. And they're drinking up their wages on beer, on rum. They're taking shots of whiskey. The saloon is seen as a place of not just liquor, but of all sorts of corruption, gambling, illegal bribery of politicians, political influence peddling, boxing matches in the back room. Boxing is seen as immoral at this time. Policemen coming in on the take. Everything evil happens in the saloon. And laws began to be passed. The Anti-Saloon League began pressing for the banning of the saloon, limit or ban the saloon, seeing the saloon as being sort of, many politicians came from saloon backgrounds, got support from soliciting votes among men in saloons. And so for reformers, this is seen as not just a place of immorality, of violence, of corruption, but also of political influence far beyond, the influence a place like this should have. The Anti-Saloon League was formed in Ohio in the 1890s, once again linked with Protestant churches and supported by major business people, including John D. Rockefeller, about the richest American who ever lived. And the Poconos' own Sebastian Kresge, founder of SS Kresge, which later evolved into Kmart, which now is going out of business. But Mr. Kresge was very, very active in this. They fought locally and nationwide for laws that would restrict or outlaw saloons. One of their prime initiatives was to pass local laws that banned the serving of free lunches in saloons. Many saloons did offer a free working man's lunch. And of course, the working man getting that lunch was expected then to buy liquor and buy a round for everybody. Proper hospitality was you bought a round, then someone would buy you a round, then someone else would buy everyone else around, and you see how it goes. So the idea of banning the free lunch was one of the big initiatives. And that's actually where the saying comes, which we still have today. There's no such thing as a free lunch, okay? Someone gives you a free lunch, they want something from you. By the early 20th century, it was clear the Anti-Saloon League was looking for a constitutional amendment that would prohibit alcohol nationwide, okay? And in fact, in late 1914, World War I was ongoing at that point. We were not involved in it. They were able actually, with pressure from the Anti-Saloon League, to get the U.S. House to narrowly pass approval of the 18th Amendment, which would prohibit alcohol in the U.S., short of the ratification needs. Across New England, across the North, temperance advocates also pushed for a local option, prohibit liquor at the county or municipal level. I mentioned Pennsylvania county, some of them banned alcohol. This was especially true in New England. Many New England towns and counties banned alcohol. Interesting enough, if any of you are familiar with the Lehigh Valley, traveling down to the valley, obviously, we had an episode there in 1896, in the early years of the Anti-Saloon League. A chapter of that league in Catasauqua, Pennsylvania, which at the time was a major iron manufacturing town, was upset that the Allentown Fair allowed drinking, served beer, and petitioned the Allentown Fair Association to ban alcohol from the duration of the fair. And the president at the time of the Allentown Fair Association was someone named General Harry Trexler. If anyone in this group is familiar with Allentown, his handwork is all over Allentown. Very wealthy local tycoon. President of the Allentown Fair at the time, he turned this down flat, saying we have no problem with liquor consumption at the fair, and that the Pennsylvania German, loves his beer. So no headway was made, at least in the Lehigh Valley, in terms of local option. But elsewhere in the country, it certainly was. Here is one of the more notorious members, Women's Christian Temperance Union, and this is Carrie Nation. Began her campaign at age 64. She's born in Kentucky. She had moved to Kansas with one of her very alcoholic husbands and been involved with the chapter of local Kansas WCTU. Now, the Kansas state constitution actually banned the saloon as an institution in the 1880s, but that constitutional ban was not being enforced. Local officials looked the other way. Saloons operated pretty much openly. So in early June of 1900, Carrie Nation, lived in a town called Kiowa, Kansas, decided to take more immediate action. She walked into a local saloon carrying bricks and full bottles, which she called her smashers, visited one saloon, then another, then another, then another. 4 local saloons visited and unloading these smashers, breaking the glass, driving bartenders to hide behind the bar as this glass shattered around them. That day, after this shocking action, which left people just gaping open mouth, she wasn't arrested. But when she did the same thing to a big hotel in the big city of Wichita, Kansas, she was arrested that December. What she said, she refused to apologize. She said she is smashing murder mills. Then she began touring the country, officially changed her name to Carry a Nation. I'm carrying a nation. And what she said about this direct action was a quote from her: moral suasion, the idea of persuading people not to drink. If there's anything that's weak and worse than useless, it's moral suasion. The hell traps of Kansas have fattened for 20 years on moral suasion. So it's time for direct action and, in her view, for legal enforcement. I want to circle back to the women's rights or feminist aspects of this. Once again, she was a woman who saw the saloon, given her own personal experience with her alcoholic husband, as being very damaging to women's interests. And in the saloons, many of them, when she was doing her smashing, she found suggestive illustrations, racy pictures, which she also smashed. And she said, it is very significant that these pictures of naked women are in saloons. Women are stripped of everything by them: husbands, sons, homes, and food. So she saw the anti-liquor campaign as a women's rights campaign. It wasn't making a lot of headway in terms of political success. I mean, some towns, some counties, et cetera, were banning this, but the Republican Party, Teddy Roosevelt, one of the outstanding figures of the party at this time, that Carrie Nation was doing her thing. He did endorse the idea of allowing local option. City or county can ban alcohol or not. In fact, he himself had been active as New York City Police Commissioner, at shutting down illegal saloon operations on Sunday. He believed in local option, but he did not believe in national prohibition. And what he said, direct quote from him, was, my experience with prohibitionists is that the best way to deal with them is to ignore them. And so little headway was made there. But a number of other states began expanding and going beyond the local and county option, actually banning alcohol statewide. And I'll throw a couple examples out there. Oklahoma, Mississippi, North Carolina, over these early years began achieving some successes at the state level. I should mention, the WCTU and other temperance groups were also active in Canada. And the Canadian government always rejected attempts at national prohibition. But here we enter the era of the First World War, 1914. Canada became involved in that war long before we did, as part of the British Empire. They were active as of fall of 1914. And temperance forces in Canada, WCTU and other groups, pressured Canada to at least allow provinces to ban alcohol as a part of the wartime effort. Anything more than 2.5% alcohol was to be banned. The entire, and I'm going through a couple slides I'd skipped over, but this is a picture of the Seagram Distillery in Canada. The entire Confederation of Canada enacted prohibition as a wartime measure by 1918. Although the province of Quebec, French Canadian province, was not very enthusiastic about that. Seagram's distillery continued operating all throughout. Interesting to see that the Canadians experimented with national prohibition long before the U.S. got involved in that effort. As we did get involved in the First World War, and of course, if you're familiar with World War I history, we stayed out of that destructive, just slaughterhouse of the war for years, not getting involved until the spring of 1917, after a number of German provocations. Once we got involved, though, the Anti-Saloon League was still very active, still very powerful, and they linked the idea of liquor with disloyalty and the idea of temperance with a good, sustained wartime effort, which had been done in Canada. As you can see, Canada was sort of the prototype for that. Here's a poster showing the linkage of liquor and the Kaiser. Hun, by the way, is a nickname for the Germans during the First World War. And you can see the barrels of booze. We're against progress. We cause poverty and crime. We waste grain, need grain for the wartime effort, feed the soldiers in the field. We make people poor. I mean, you can't say too much beyond that. So it's a sustained effort to say that drinking liquor, selling liquor was undermining the very important U.S. war effort, diverting food, et cetera, from it. There were also some hints that Germans and other subversives were involved in the liquor trade. Of course, Germans were involved in brewing. Most American breweries, quite a few were owned by German immigrants, Anheuser-Busch, many others. So suspicions of Germans also spread to kind of put some momentum behind this. And using the patriotism of the war effort, the Anti-Saloon League introduced once again this 18th Amendment. And in this case, it was able to pass given the fervor of the war. Actually passed in December of 1917, being 36 states to ratify it, and the decisive state was Nebraska in January of 1919, and that meant it was going to go into effect. New York and Pennsylvania ratified soon after. New Jersey held off, interestingly enough, until the early 1920s. But that is the famous 18th Amendment. I'm actually going to read it to you. After 1 year from the ratification of this article, the manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors within the importation thereof into, or the exportation thereof from the United States and all territories subject to it is hereby prohibited. Very simple. Okay, and that went into effect in January of 1920. Now, to actually define and enforce this required an act of Congress. The amendment does say Congress will have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. So the actual legislation that passed to enforce this was called the Volstead Act. President Wilson had approved of the 18th Amendment. He said it was a good thing. President Woodrow Wilson, a good thing for the country, part of the war effort. The Volstead Act, this may be a little confusing. He tried to veto it, actually did veto it. Congress overrode his veto. Why would he support the 18th Amendment and veto the Volstead Act? Very simple. The Volstead Act was actually stricter in its definition of alcohol than the framers of that amendment had intended. Okay, the amendment had been in the back of people's minds aimed primarily at distilled spirits, strong liquors, gin, whiskey, things of that sort. There had been sort of a understanding, gentleman's agreement, that weaker beer and wine would still be permitted under the 18th Amendment. Well, the Volstead Act prohibited everything. Okay, any alcoholic beverage over 0.5% alcohol content is prohibited. Okay, so that's actually stricter than many people expected. Hence Wilson's veto. Not enough. The Volstead Act still went into effect in January of 1920. Okay, and here's the announcement of the ratification, and the U.S. is now dry. Let's discuss some of the provisions of this. Okay, the amendment and the Volstead Act did ban the manufacture, okay, even home manufacture, or sale or transport of alcohol. It did not ban possession of alcohol in one's home. Okay, never did. So if you had stocks of liquor from before, nobody was going to raid your house and try and break into your basement, try and find what barrels of beer were there. In that sense, it was very different than the kind of drug prohibitions we have today, because existing stocks of alcohol were not to be disturbed. And in fact, very quickly, people began selling ingredients that, if you put them together at home, might, quote, might produce an alcoholic beverage. And that was not technically manufacture of alcohol, at least not for sale. But the fact that people were selling ingredients that might be combined in a home setting to produce small amounts of alcohol for home consumption was never shut down by Prohibition. So what it was actually after was large-scale sale, transport, saloon, manufacture of any sort of alcoholic product. So commercial production very quickly did shut down across the country. Many breweries either went out of business or switched to other products. And one of the more famous examples is the Yuengling Brewery, one of the oldest ones in the country up in Pottsville, PA, which shifted over to making ice cream. And they still do. There's a branch of the Yuengling that still today manufactures high quality ice cream. A little plug. But many breweries simply went out of business entirely. It's very hard to quantify today, once this was enacted, how many Americans exactly changed their drinking habits. We really don't know. It is obvious that liquor consumption dropped drastically. It simply could not be obtained anywhere near as easily as it could before. Okay, so obviously the consumption dropped quite a bit, but as you know from casual histories of Prohibition, violations popped up very quickly, linked to two primary issues: illegal production of alcohol, especially in rural areas, that's industrial production, backwoods stills, things of that sort, and smuggling from nearby Canada, Quebec, especially where Seagram's was, from Cuba, from Mexico. And this is an example you see right here, a barge bringing in barrels of beer across the St. Lawrence River. High-powered speedboats began bringing them in. Freighters began anchoring just off the coast, international waters, and quiet, low-profile speedboats would unload and bring it in to the mainland. In the backcountry, bootleggers, moonshiners, would manufacture whiskey primarily, and then transport it up and down the road in famously fast cars. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on. Stocks of industrial alcohol, you could still manufacture industrial alcohol, it's used in a lot of industrial uses, would be siphoned off, raided. That's not drinkable. So oftentimes you have toxic effects from that. So, violations began popping up pretty quickly. There's a famous novel called Babbitt. Some of you have probably read it, mid-1920s. And in Babbitt, he's a middle-class real estate broker, very traditional middle-class guy. But in hosting a dinner party, he breaks out the liquor. And all the guests kind of know it's coming, and they're waiting for that moment when he's going to break out, the hidden stocks of alcohol, the sacred cocktails, and he brings it out and mixes it up with great ceremony, and everyone has a drink, not a lot, because there isn't a lot, and they feel that glow of breaking the rules, And so there is violation going here and there. Of course, we'll talk more about bigger violations in a minute. But it's very hard to quantify, except that we do know just from casual surveys of the amount of liquor found to be illegally circulating, that it was still there, but the levels of consumption clearly had dropped dramatically because there simply wasn't that much available. Very quickly, you have gangsters appearing. You have federal revenue agents breaking up liquor here, smashing barrels of booze, etc. You've got gangsters. You got people running liquor in across the borders. Al Capone in Chicago, many other gangsters nationwide who had been there before doing other things, gambling mostly, now got involved in the liquor trade and made much more money from that than they ever made from these other operations. Capone said very dryly, "I make my money by supplying a public demand." What more can be said than that? Across the country, hundreds of prominent politicians, policemen, judges were involved in flagrant corruption from gang payoffs. We think that New York City hosted over 10,000 illegal speakeasies. And of course, now this define a speakeasy. It's a place that's not supposed to be there. It's a bar, saloon, where it's hidden behind some sort of legitimate business. And if you want to get a drink and you know where it is, you say the secret word, and then you're suddenly in the saloon. 10,000 in New York City. Gangsters made money. They sold liquor. They fought each other. Obviously, you've seen some of the open air gun battles in the 1920s between different rival gangs involved in liquor. Against all these gangsters and underworld elements were pitted a force of treasury agents. Enforcement of this Volstead Act was placed in the U.S. Treasury. About 3,000 treasury agents were involved in trying to fight the gangs, and it was sort of an uneven battle. Flip ahead to one of my more famous ones. So that's Al Capone, of course, a prototypical gangster. There's the man who brought him down. That is the famous Elliot Ness, who was a federal treasury agent assigned to Chicago, actually in the early 1930s, 1931. And he put together a team of honest agents who would not take gang bribes, and they became known as the Untouchables because of that. And did in fact, raid Capone's operations, arrested corrupt agents, made thousands of arrests, did in fact take down the Capone machine and get Capone put in prison for tax evasion. Some members of this group may or may not have seen reruns of an old TV series called The Untouchables. It was about Elliot Ness, made in the 1950s. The series exaggerated a bit. It showed him operating across the country, bringing down all kinds of gangsters with huge gunfights. Of course, he really just operated in Chicago, but he did in fact, shut down the Capone operation. But essentially, there were, that's one of the few successes. Treasury agents nationwide were not that successful at stopping any of this. Use the example of Pennsylvania, our local Pennsylvania. Very difficult to enforce prohibition. Not a lot of energy in it. The agents assigned didn't have a lot of enthusiasm for it. State and local police were expected to help treasury agents in enforcing prohibition, but they didn't really have much interest in doing that, especially in cities which had large populations, immigrant populations, so-called wet populations who were used to drinking. Police were oftentimes drawn from the same population, had little interest in doing anything effective about it. Many of them were on the take, on multiple takes, including police chiefs, judges, and very high up in law enforcement system. My wife's late uncle said that he was told that he himself had been a bootlegger as a baby. And you might wonder, how can that be? Growing up in South Bethlehem, various law-evading relatives hid barrels of illegal whiskey in his baby carriage as he's been pushed around South Bethlehem. So open defiance across the state. Once again, to make it local, I did some checking. There's not a lot of evidence of major tensions here in Monroe County. Speakeasies, major speakeasies, any kind of bootleg operations. I mean, I'm sure there were some, but it was never a news focus with a lot of sweeping violations as you saw in cities like the Lehigh Valley, or especially down in Philadelphia. So rather quieter atmosphere here. Gifford Pinchot became governor of Pennsylvania in the early 1920s, Republican, and you may have heard of him. Of course, he has a famous house in Milford, PA, Gray Towers, involved in forestry and good friend of Teddy Roosevelt. Gifford Pinchot was a Republican, enthusiastic, dry, really believed in the prohibition cause, devoted a few more resources to it, but wasn't able to achieve much more success. Now I'll bring this up for a second just to show a little bit about some of the changes you see in the prohibition movement as time went on. And this is where I'm going to refer back to something I said earlier in my presentation, that prohibition had begun as a reformist initiative linked with things like abolition, women's rights, innovative ideas to improve society like that. By the time it gets to the mid-1920s, prohibition is becoming more and more of a reactionary movement. The tone of it is shifting a bit. Who's interested in it? Less innovators, okay? The impetus shifts over to people trying to protect America from vice vice brought by immigrants, vice carried by blacks, by immoral people of all sorts, people violating church morality, etc. Interesting to see historically sometimes, and this can be the case, the tone of something, sort of where something's coming from can change. And so this is obviously a big Ku Klux Klan parade in Washington, D.C., one of the famous ones on Pennsylvania Avenue. And by the mid-1920s, the KKK, which had arisen to fight obviously against blacks, but also against immigrants, against Catholic and Jewish immigrants, had taken on the dry cause as their own. Their movement for what they called 100% Americanism also included a strong belief that liquor should be banned, the country should be dry, protect morality, and keep immigrant ideas and, once again, sadly to be racial, black influence out of the public sphere. So more and more, you might say the conservative elements of society, people looking backwards toward an older fashioned America, became the pushers, the motivators behind maintaining prohibition. I thought I'd bring this up. This is something that got a lot of public attention in the late 1920s. Ira Reeves had been a chief federal enforcement officer for the prohibition cause in New Jersey, and went into the job very enthusiastically, believed in the cause, found himself up against a wall of defiance and corruption. Local police defied his efforts to shut down speakeasies and bootleggers. Politicians defied his agents, basically laughed in their faces. Officials held huge booze-soaked banquets. Judges, when cases were brought to them with obvious evidence of illegal liquor manufacture and sales, would dismiss the cases offhand, simply saying lack of evidence. So basically, corruption had permeated every level of society and made the effort to enforce prohibition, in Jersey at least, sort of a joke. And what Reeves in this book pointed out was that he had become a convert to legalization of alcohol. That the prohibition of alcohol had led to such a depth of corruption, violence, rise of organized criminal gangs, that in a sense the cure for the problem was becoming worse than the problem. And so, given this, with this book, Reeves became a fierce advocate for removal of prohibition, repeal of prohibition. Became an advocate for what we call a wet America. Other people were involved in this too. There were other converts away from the dry cause toward the wet cause. A women's organization arose. Women's Organization for National Prohibition Reform arose by the late 1920s and became a serious advocate for repeal from a women's standpoint, saying that prohibition was causing violent gang criminality and had to be stopped. There was some concern that that group was being funded by hidden liquor manufacturing interests who wanted to make a comeback, by tavern innkeepers who wanted to make a comeback. That may be true. Hard to tell where the tentacles end, but it was a visible movement pushing for an end to prohibition. By the late 1920s, you do have politicians openly urging repeal, especially Democratic politicians. Al Smith was a New York Irish Catholic Democrat who ran for president in 1928, known as a wet, believer in a wet New York, someone who thought prohibition should be repealed. Fiorello LaGuardia, many of you have heard that name, famous, energetic mayor of New York City. He was actually a Republican, was a strong convert to the wet cause and pushed very hard for the idea of, that this is doing more harm than good. Once again, reinforcing criminality. In 1932, Franklin Roosevelt, in the midst of obviously the depth of the Great Depression, ran for president against Herbert Hoover. And part of his platform was to repeal, the official Democratic platform, repeal prohibition, at least for beer and wine. Okay, it wasn't that clear it was going to be for distilled spirits, but at least they were going to repeal the prohibition on beer and wine. And the reason for doing this, the motivation was to end the violent gang permeation of society. And the second reason, of course, is the Great Depression. to give the economy a boost by allowing liquor manufacturer, beer manufacturer, which would apply to employment, and allow some kind of public accommodation to open. Roosevelt said he did not want the old-fashioned saloon to return, but some sort of public, maybe restaurant or some sort of defensible sales of alcohol, provide employment. So essentially, he was elected. I think there's no surprise about that. Hoover was defeated badly. Roosevelt became president, began to quickly introduce the idea of the New Deal. And in March 1933, not long after his inauguration, Congress passed the 21st Amendment to the Constitution, which was the only one that substantively repeals a previous amendment, essentially repealed the 18th. And the text is very simple. The 18th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States is hereby repealed. Simple as that. Section 2, the transportation or importation into any state or territory for delivery or use therein of intoxicating liquors in violation of the laws thereof is hereby prohibited. Okay? So what that reminds you of is that the repeal of prohibition did not necessarily end state prohibition. It didn't enforce the end of prohibition throughout the country. It just ended federal prohibition. Here's what Franklin Roosevelt said when this was effectively repealed. The repeal was very fast. December of 1933. It only took a few months to pass this and get this ratified. Roosevelt said, "I ask the wholehearted cooperation of all of our citizens to the end that this return of individual freedom shall not be accompanied by the repugnant conditions that existed prior to the adoption of the 18th Amendment. I especially ask that no state will authorize the return of the saloon, either in its old form or in some modern guise." Well, we can look around and see how true that prediction was, how effective that wish was. Within the federal system, as I said before, under repeal, the one sort of loophole was that states were still permitted to prohibit alcohol if they wanted to. And many states did. Oklahoma did not repeal its state prohibition law. Many other states did not repeal them. Many states allowed county prohibitions, and they still do. One of the more famous things you've probably heard about is that the county in which Jack Daniel's whiskey is made is a dry county. If someone visits the distillery, which I have not done, I am told that they will sell you product which you can take away. But the understanding is such product will not be opened until you've crossed the county line, because sales of those spirits inside that county is still prohibited. Here in Pennsylvania, oh, by the way, before I get to that, let's just look at what happened. This is a pro-ratification parade. When the amendment had been passed, it was still waiting ratification. And here are the scenes in December of 1933 when the 21st Amendment was actually ratified and prohibition was officially repealed. I mean, I think the pictures speak for themselves. You know, basically, yahoo! It's off to the races, off to the bar. I should just mention, may as well be a good point. Within a few years, alcohol consumption, which was now being measured because it's now legal, rose to just about 2 gallons per capita, which is where it stayed ever since. Okay, so we're roughly a 2-gallon per capita consuming country right now. I may as well mention something else. Let's do a comparison. We drink about 2 gallons per capita. We are number 48 on a list of alcohol consumption compiled by the World Health Organization, WHO. The country of Belarus, just west of Russia, is number 1. Per capita consumption there is 4.5 gallons of alcohol per person. Russia stands at 4. Slovakia is at 3.5. France, Ireland, and England are all around 3 gallons per capita. We are at 2, obviously. Mexico and Japan are both below us at 1.8 gallons. So just so you know where we kind of stand and what the long-term effects of prohibition actually were. Let me get rid of that. I'll fly in the ointment there. Here in Pennsylvania, if I can skip ahead, we ended up with an interesting situation. That's Gifford Pinchot. And of course, he was governor again when Prohibition was repealed. And Gifford Pinchot remained a very ardent believer in Prohibition. He was very ardent dry. And he was obviously, swallowed this very reluctantly. The state legislature was able to override his opposition and allow Pennsylvania to have liquor sales. He would have kept state prohibition, but the legislature was controlled by Democrats. They allowed liquor sales. But Gifford Pinchot insisted against Democratic opposition that Pennsylvania must have a state-controlled liquor dispensary system. They must have state stores. He felt that private liquor stores, as were established across the river in New Jersey, would allow all kinds of alcohol dissipation. And so he insisted on having state liquor dispensaries. And you can see an illustration right there of today's liquor store. I am old enough to recall that the original Pennsylvania state stores up until the 1980s looked nothing like this. They're Pinchot's original design, which was a very forbidding, cold, small store in which a customer walk in could not approach the liquor shelves, had to approach a desk, almost like a pharmacy, behind which stood attendants who would then show the person the catalog, look through, decide what the person wanted, what the customer wanted. They go back to the shelves and bring it out. And their job was supposed to be to inspect every customer to see if that person was inebriated. If that person appeared to be immoral or intoxicated, was this person worthy of selling liquor to? So it was a very controlled system. What's left of it today is, of course, the state store system that we have here. So the U.S. drinks about 2 gallons of alcohol per day. I was going to do a couple other things and look at some other mood-altering substances of the time, which have now become obviously illegal, and kind of compare the situation of Prohibition, these other things. And the first one, as you can see right here, is sales of obviously cocaine toothache drops. I mean, up until the early 20th century, and this is no joking matter in our era of real severe addiction problems. So I do not mean to make light of it, but products like cocaine, like opiates, were very openly available. Typically not in very strong doses, but they were there. They were sold in medicines. Opiates were available over the counter in pain medications, in soothing liquors, which many women drank, not really controlled in any way. You've all probably heard that beverages like Coca-Cola contain small amounts of cocaine up until 1905. And so these things were pretty available. In December of 1914, around the time that discussion was advancing of prohibition of alcohol, Congress passed the Narcotics Act that banned the importation or sale of cocaine, opiates, etc., in the U.S. And I think, for better or worse, probably a healthy thing to have done, although some people today disagree. Part of the passage of that act was rather lurid stories about white women being lured into slavery in Chinese opium dens up and down the West Coast and Chinatowns across the U.S. Stories also coming from the South, and this is going to be offensive, but here it is. Supposedly wild-eyed black cocaine fiends attacking white women in the South because cocaine takes away all their inhibitions and puts white women in danger. So obviously there's a sort of hysterical racial element to some of this. But so these were banned except for dispensation to a customer with a medical prescription. And that's kind of where it stood up until today. Another issue of the time was this one. Cannabis, marijuana. You can see from the picture there, the spelling was different than we have today. It was not a major presence in the US before about 1900. Was not a major factor. It was apparently in the Southwest, but not nationally major. Began drifting in around that time with Mexican immigrants and with Caribbean immigrants coming into the American South. And its reputation became kind of interlaced with that of these immigrants as being dangerous, immoral, all the things you can think of, but wasn't really addressed by any laws. That the Narcotics Act I mentioned before, the Harrison Act, which addressed cocaine and opiates, did not address marijuana. It wasn't addressed at all. But there was, interestingly enough, a fear that cocaine and people addicted to cocaine and opiates would advance into using marijuana. So interesting reversal of our current conception of this as a gateway drug, marijuana first, then the harder drugs. Thinking back then was that the harder drugs might lead to marijuana. We didn't do anything to restrict it, though. There was no laws passed. Other countries had. Much of the British Empire banned cannabis. Canada had banned cannabis also. Greece, the Ottoman Empire. A number of other nations did. We did not. A number of American states began passing cannabis bans by late 1920s, which does remind you that it's quite true. During the 1920s, the era of alcohol prohibition, in much of the US, over half of the US, cannabis, marijuana use was legal, during that time. Interestingly enough, after Prohibition ended, after Prohibition was repealed, a man named Harry Anslinger, a federal enforcement agent who had been in charge of alcohol prohibition in much of the eastern US, and during that time had been asked about marijuana and had said it was not a problem that he could see, not worthy of being addressed by federal law. After Prohibition was repealed in 1933, he then changed his tune. And Anslinger wrote that cannabis, marijuana, is the deadly, dreadful poison that racks and tears not only the body, but the very heart and soul of every human being who once becomes a slave to it in any of its cruel and devastating forms. Marijuana is a shortcut to the insane asylum. And so in 1937, not late, 1937, a sweeping federal, the so-called Marijuana Tax Act was passed that effectively banned cannabis across the US. And of course, that's still in effect. So interestingly enough, by the mid-late 1930s, alcohol was now widely available throughout most of the US, not everywhere, but most of the US. Whereas these other intoxicants were now living or existing under a very separate and very different anti-drug control regime. So what can we conclude from thinking about this Prohibition era? A couple things. First of all, this nation is capable, as you can see, of enormous sweeping social experiments. It is possible to do that, but the law of unintended consequences never fails to have its effects. Okay, never forget that. Second thing, concerted pressure over decades and decades and decades can win the day. It won with this. It won with the women's suffrage issue relatively simultaneously. It can win the day. Something else reminds us that the base of support for any cause can shift over time. Okay, the people supporting it, the sort of feeling behind a cause can shift as Prohibition shifted from being a reformist, innovative cause to being a cause really led by conservative elements in society. Last of all, Americans, like most in the North Atlantic, will have their access to alcohol. They will find a way to do that. But last thing, this implicitly recognizes a trade-off, a serious trade-off. Many under that open alcohol regime will suffer uncontrolled addiction. That is a price society does pay for this. I'm going to wrap it up there. My question to you is there a martini sitting on either side of me? And that question will remain unanswered for now. But thanks for your attention, and I'll take any questions you have at this point.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me? Not yet. Okay, can you hear me?
Well, I can. I'm not sure about the others.
Okay, good. That was wonderfully fascinating. Thank you so much. We do have questions for you, okay?
I'm ready for them.
First one, how severe were the penalties for those caught manufacturing, selling, or transporting alcohol?
Fines and prison terms that could vary by jurisdiction. But as you can see, whether those are actually going to be enforced depended upon local authorities and how interested they were in enforcing them. So it's very uneven across the country, but significant fines and significant prison time. And of course, prisons of the day were no picnic, put it that way. So it was nothing to take lightly. Your only hope as a violator was to be in a jurisdiction where you had the right influence, then your case would be dismissed.
Wow, wow. So after Prohibition was repealed, were the bootleggers, the criminals released?
Yes, they were. Yeah, for the most part, they were let out. Although I'm not sure, and that's something a little bit beyond my knowledge. Not every, of course, state by state. I'm not sure if every state released people that quickly. Of course, most people were held in state prisons, not federal. And so federal jurisdiction doesn't really apply. So that's a question I can answer. Unless there were other issues involved, like violence or tax violations, like in the case of Capone. But at the state level, I really can't fully answer that question because we don't know what every state did with its violators.
Okay. Next question. Is it true that the number of people drinking increased because of Prohibition?
No, we don't think so. In fact, the number seems to have decreased significantly, possibly a third or a fourth of what it had been. We hear about the violations of Prohibition, and of course, it broke down and failed and led to all kinds of chaos and criminality. But that doesn't mean that everybody was drinking. They definitely did not increase. As far as we know, numbers shrank to probably about 1/3 of the previous drinkers still having access to alcohol. So actually, in the sense, was effective. Now, a third is still a lot of people, and that's part of why Prohibition was seen to have failed, because it was simply not enforceable. But definitely did not increase or stimulate more drinking.
It's interesting that the government agency that oversaw Prohibition was the Treasury.
Treasury Department. Yeah. Why that was decided, that's unclear, but it was felt that they had a broad federal reach. Of course, they're involved in anti-counterfeiting effects also, of course, in revenue collection for alcohol sales. So it was felt that that was appropriate for them to cover it. At the time, the FBI was not in the position it is later on. There was something called the Bureau of Investigation, and J. Edgar Hoover was involved in it, but it didn't yet have the sweep that the later Federal Bureau of Investigation had to investigate interstate crimes.
So did they have to increase their personnel once this was passed? I would guess they'd have to have a lot more people.
Yeah, they had to have those agents, 3,000 agents, which is, they were hired for this particular mission. That's not enough people to cover the country effectively, as you can see, against armies, bootleggers, etc. I should add, by the way, that the high speed, people may have heard in the group about the high speed hot rod moonshiners and bootleggers. That continued after repeal, because don't forget, many states still banned alcohol and also banned interstate transportation of alcohol without some kind of state tax control. So a lot of people in backcountry areas still manufacture illegal whiskey mostly, long after Prohibition had been repealed. And we're still hot rodding these loads of whiskey down backcountry roads to get it to places that it wasn't supposed to be. And they'd be run down, sometimes by so-called revenuers or state police. And so you have these encounters up in the mountains involving high-speed, moonshiners, basically, long after 1933.
So it looks like we have to blame Gifford Pinchot for the Pennsylvania state store liquor laws here.
Yes, we do.
But there's talk about privatizing the liquor stores now. Do you know anything about that, or can you speak to that?
I can't speak to it myself. I know it's ironic that, Republicans in the state legislature have been pushing for privatization for many years now. Of course, a Republican insisted upon state store sales in the first place. So it's kind of an ironic shift of party feeling on that. I grew up in New Jersey, and so I know we have private liquor stores in New Jersey. I don't have any particular thoughts, although, I'll tell you, personally, not a statement of belief of the college or anything, just speaking for myself. I like the fact that the state store employees have these secure, well-paid union jobs. And I know in New Jersey, where I visit quite a bit, my family's there, private liquor stores are stocked by either family members or sometimes young kids, or young people in their 20s. I have no idea what the pay level is like, job security. I'm thinking it's probably a lot better in Pennsylvania. So were they to privatize the state stores here, we might get a better selection, I wouldn't say Jersey stores are necessarily all that better. I personally, maybe I'm just a soft heart, would feel bad for the estate store employees who wouldn't have those secure positions anymore.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned Canada banning alcohol too.
Right.
Were there any other countries that did so, or was this really unique to North America?
Really just North America at the time. Of course, Islamic countries always ban alcohol, then and today. But in terms of Western countries that tried to prohibit alcohol, it's really just Canada and the US. There was no prohibition effort in Britain. although there was a very strong temperance movement there too. The Methodists, especially in Britain, especially during World War I, but no attempt to ban alcohol sales in Britain at that point. So as far as I know, we're the only two, I guess you'd say, Western countries that actually tried to do this.
Okay, and it looks like the last question we have is, I'm curious as to whether the popularity of water fountains originated with the temperance movement.
That's a fine question for further review. I can imagine there might be a link because once again, the centrality of the cold, pure water idea as a beverage was certainly originated with the temperance movement. Having potable water accessible in public places, I can see a linkage there. I'm not going to say I have evidence for it, but I can imagine a link between those two things.
Yeah, I thought that was a fun question too. Good, good. Well, thank you. I don't see any other questions. Looks like we've answered them all. I want to thank you again so much for spending this evening with us. It was very, very informative. I know I learned a lot. So you did a great job. Thank you so much, Dr. Alnutt.
And thank you to everyone for coming. Thank you.
Yes, wonderful. Thank you. Have a great night, everybody.